Dear friends, this is a lecture on cultural studies. This is going to be the third lecture of the series titled Cultural Studies. The earlier two were titled as What is Culture and on linking language, literature and culture. In my second lecture titled Linking Language, Literature and Culture, I said that my next lecture will be on the title What is Cultural Studies. But friends, I think that Understanding Cultural Studies is a more suitable title, because what we are going to discuss here is a sort of an in-depth analysis or sort of an in-depth attempt to understand cultural studies. So hence I have named it as Understanding Cultural Studies. Before we go to the path of our discussion, let us at the outset quote three sources. What these three sources have to say about cultural studies. One is Encyclopedia Britannica. The other is that what the website of University of Glasgow says about cultural studies while announcing its course on cultural studies. And the third source will be again what the University of North Carolina says in its website about cultural studies while announcing its course on cultural studies. Friends, dear, Encyclopedia Britannica says that cultural studies is an interdisciplinary field and it is concerned with the role of social institutions in shaping of culture. As a field of study, it emerged in Britain in the late 1950s and subsequently it has spread internationally. Originally, it began with the Center of Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham and with scholars like Richard Hoggart, Stuart Hall and Raymond Williams. So beginning with these scholars, cultural studies became a well-established field in academics and it has a broad influence in sociology, anthropology, historiography, literary criticism, philosophy and art criticism. Among its central concerns are the place of race, ethnicity, class and gender in the production of cultural knowledge. Dear friends, let us now move on to the next source, what the University of Glasgow website says, and it says that cultural studies traces its relationships among aesthetic, anthropological, political and economic aspect of cultural production and reproduction. The website says that the scholars and practitioners of cultural studies often begin their inquiries by questioning the common understandings, beliefs and histories that shape our world. This type of inquiry assumes that culture is not a fact to be understood and explained. What demands attention is how culture constitutes diverse worlds and how it can be mobilized to change those worlds. So cultural studies relies on interdisciplinary research on the formation of knowledge, power and difference. The scholars and practitioners of cultural studies explore constructions of race, class, ability, citizenship, gender and sexuality in their effort to understand the structures and practices of domination and resistance that shape contemporary societies. Many different topics surface as part of this exploration, such as everyday practices that structure the creation and reception of cultural artifacts, relations between producers and consumers in the circulation of global communities, and claims to membership in particular communities as they undergo transformation. Now, let us move on to the third source, and that is the University of North Carolina website. It says that cultural studies is an innovative interdisciplinary field that investigates the way in which culture creates and transforms individual experiences, everyday life, social relations, and power equations. Research and teaching in the field explores the relations between culture, understood as human expressive and symbolic activities, and cultures understood as distinctive ways of life. Combining the strengths of the social sciences and the humanities, cultural studies draws on methods and theories from literary studies, sociology, communication studies, history, cultural anthropology, and economics. By working across the boundaries among these fields, cultural studies addresses new questions and problems of today's world. And dear friends, rather than seeking answers that will hold for all time, cultural studies actually develops flexible tools that adapt to this rapidly changing world. The website further says that cultural life is not only concerned with symbolic communication, it is also the domain in which we set collective tasks for ourselves and begin to grapple with them as changing communities. Cultural studies is devoted to understanding the processes through which societies and the diverse groups within those societies come to terms with history, community life, and the challenges of the future. So this is what the three sources says. Now, dear friends, when we look at these three sources, we can come to a point. We can take a point that cultural studies provides a space for scholarly dialogues which draws upon theory and methods from several disciplines: anthropology, history, literary studies, philosophy, political economy, and sociology. It also develops a very specific methodology for cultural studies, whereas traditional disciplines strive to produce stable objects of study. Researchers in cultural studies attempt to account for exactly the instability of objects, events, and processes under changing capitalist relations. Friends, it is quite hard to define cultural studies in black and white terms because of its multidisciplinary nature. It is more concerned with the study of culture and how culture shapes our society and its individual. So cultural studies focuses less on institutions, dear friends. It focuses less on economics and it focuses more on texts and audiences. So cultural studies actually investigates the activities of everyday life. Note this, cultural studies investigates the activities of everyday life. Let us for some time ponder upon the origin and the development of this field of study. In this regard, let us now first talk about its substantial growth in the context of United Kingdom, that is England or Britain, where it has grown. It began, it originated, and it has grown into a vast field of study, and it has its own history, its own development. Friends, you must note here that it has a slightly different history and development in the American context. But dear friend, right now let us concentrate on the growth and origin and the history of cultural studies with reference to Britain, with reference to England. Uh, I believe that three names unknowingly contributed towards the establishment of cultural studies. Unknowingly, because at that time this particular terminology was not there, and those three names were Matthew Arnold, F.R. Lewis, and T.S. Eliot. Friends, these three scholars, these three theorists wrote a lot about culture, human culture, about human life, about what is best in culture. Uh, if you remember Arnold writing that very famous text called Culture and Anarchy, F.R. Lewis in the 20th century talking a lot about culture and talking about the culture and civilization tradition. Then we have Eliot also talking about culture a lot, and they talk about actually the representation of what is best in our society. Culture as the representation of what is best in our society. But when we move on to the second part of the 20th century, we have scholars like Raymond Williams and E.P. Thompson who regarded culture as ordinary. So Arnold, Eliot, and F.R. Lewis, for them culture is the best in our civilization. In the second part of the second half of the 20th century, when cultural studies actually started taking its shape and form, we have a scholar like Raymond Williams and E.P. Thompson who looked at culture as ordinary, and they said that all activities are cultural. They said that every activity encompassing the working class culture, is encompassing the common man culture, is ordinary. They talked about popular culture. Then the third step in the field of cultural studies is comes with the form of the establishment of the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, BCCS. BCCS, it is popularly known as. So, and here we see scholars like Dick Hebbage talking about culture as resistance, culture as a means of resistance. And here comes the concept of the study of the subcultures. Then the fourth stage of cultural studies comes with scholars like Angela McRobbie and Paul Gilroy and Jeffrey Weeks. When they talked about cultural identity, it was in the 1980s and 1990s when these scholars, Angela McRobbie, Paul Gilroy, and Jeffrey Weeks, talk about cultural identity. They expanded the studies of class to gender. So here comes gender playing a very important role in cultural studies. The next stage of the in the development of cultural studies is called cultural populism, and we have a scholar like John Fiske, Fiske. So this John Fiske talks about cultural populism. He insists that what is popular must be good and must be worthy of study. We move on to the next stage, and here comes a very important stage, a very new stage in the field of cultural studies, where the political dimension was added, where the scholars like Joanna Zielinska was able to find links of culture to the new social movements. Dear friends, so these are the different stages of the evolution of this field of cultural studies. So the focus of cultural studies is about shared social meanings that are generated by culture, and how culture helps us make a sense of the world around us. So in doing this, cultural studies is also concerned with the issues of power and ideology. The tradition of thought that cultural studies is associated with has overall a sort of a Marxist emphasis. So Marxism and the Marxist ideology can be seen as the fountainhead of this field called cultural studies, because it is also concerned with the equation of power, ideology, etc. So ideas and values are embedded in popular culture. This is what we have been believed. Culture is related to the social structure of man. These are often the ideas and values of mainstream society. Culture influences the audience to accept those values. Meanings, it has been believed, and it is said, it was also theorized that meanings are created. Actually, we do not have, words do not have their own actual meanings. We create meaning. So it is said that meanings are created, they are repeated, and when we repeat those meanings, they are reinforced. And with this reinforcement of meaning, they become common sense. And when they become common sense, they are seen as natural. So this is what the cultural studies scholars believe about meaning. They believe that words are actually the tombstones of meaning. It is basically we, the user, the reader, the listener, who gives a meaning to a particular word or a particular text. So meanings, the cultural studies people, the researchers believe that meanings are created, and we repeat those meanings. We, with the repetition, the meanings are reinforced, and with the reinforcement, the meanings become common sense, and hence they become natural. Friends, a bit earlier I was saying that in the different stages of cultural studies, there was a phase in which popular culture was accepted as the mainstream culture. Earlier, the culture was a bit elitist, when it was said that the best in culture must be represented, and we have the belief that culture is actually a kind of a elitist thing. But the scholars, the researchers, and the theorizers of cultural studies believe that popular culture is basically the arena of cultural studies. Popular culture, according to Stuart Hall, popular culture is an arena of consent and resistance. So Stuart Hall highlights that how we might agree or disagree with the interpretation of different cultural contexts and cultural texts. So the emphasis is on audience. The emphasis is on the reader. The emphasis is on the listener. Different groups, dear friends, interpret the texts differently. There is a resistance to, and there is a negotiation of the ideological meaning carried in the text. So this is what we call Hall's encoding and decoding, where people may either accept the preferred meaning, or people may reject the preferred meaning that is embedded in a text. So people might also have a negotiated response, accepting something and rejecting other elements. So it is suggested that we also generate our own forms of culture. And when we say this, here comes the point of subcultures. So it is said that we also generate our own forms of culture, our own understanding of culture, our own representation of culture in the form of our subcultures. So popular culture and other forms of culture are then where both incorporation and resistance takes place. Dear friends, let us once again move on to the history part of cultural studies. And when we look into the history of this field of knowledge, this field of study, we refer to certain schools. Uh, Let us now first talk about the Frankfurt School. And the big names that belong to this Frankfurt School is Theodor Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Herbert Marcuse, Horkheimer, and Jürgen Habermas. So these are the famous names of that Frankfurt School of Cultural Studies. It was an anti-romanticist school. It was also anti-enlightenment, and this school was influenced by Marxism, and the Marxist ideology, the Marxist belief that ideology is dispersed through culture. The Marxist belief that alienation from means of production. This Frankfurt School talks about a sort of an ambiguous relationship to popular culture as an important field of study, as a tool of ideology. It is this Frankfurt School is also anti-bourgeois. It is in its approach. It is a structuralist. The emphasis is there on a structure over individual. So preference on a structure over individual. A tendency towards an ahistorical analysis of the things. So this is what Frankfurt School was all about. Those friends, now we move on to the next school of cultural studies, which is very much known by its most important exponent, Ferdinand de Saussure, and it is known as the cultural, I mean the French school of cultural studies, French theory, you can say. And Saussure, as I said, is the most important representative. This school has a linguistic bent. It has linguistic dominating as at its philosophy, at its thought. It talks about difference. It also it also talks about Derrida's concept of deconstruction. It also talks about Foucault and his discourses over language, Foucault's concept of disciplining the body, Foucault's concept of power. This French school, or the French School of Cultural Studies, is also having a whole group of French feminists, and they're concerned with phallologocentrism. Dear friends, let us now move on to a very prominent and perhaps a very important school of cultural studies, which has been seen as the mother school, the mother institution of cultural studies, and that is the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, which is also popularly known as the British Cultural Studies. And you know, the big name is Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, Angela McRobbie, Dick Hebage, and you know that very great Raymond Williams. So this school conceptualizes power. It talks about the concept of power. It focuses on the resistance in popular culture. It talks about hybridity in culture, and it talks about the presence of subcultures, the creation of subcultures in human society. It also, this school, the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, is more responsive towards the concept of race, gender, and nation. Let us now go into some theory part of cultural studies, let us now try to introduce cultural studies theoretically, a bit theoretically. Dear friends, according to Raymond Williams, who is the one of the founders of cultural studies, there are three uses of the term culture. One is the basic culture as an artistic activity. When we are engaged in music, literature, theater, films, painting. So culture as artistic activity. Another is culture as a way of life. When we talk about anthropology and the different schools of sociology also talk about it, constructing meaning of symbols of particular way of life, signifying practices. For example, to study culture is to study the meaning of a style of dress, a norm, a language, etc. In this sense, however, the definition must be distinguished from the concept of society. The society refers to the pattern of social interactions and relationships between individuals and groups, and it creates culture. And the third aspect which Raymond Williams point out regarding culture is culture as a process of development. Cultural as a historical process of human development. And here he illustrates. He says that let us take an example of rock and roll. And this dance form, rock and roll, may be analyzed by the skill of the performers. So when we do so, when we analyze rock and roll by the skill of the performers, it is an artistic activity we are looking at. This can also be analyzed by its association with youth culture. So it is when we are doing so, we are basically analyzing it with the second aspect of culture, that is, we are looking at it as a way of life. And as a historical process, this rock and roll as a musical form is originated from older musical forms, and that also influences the later musical forms. So look here, when we analyze rock and roll as a form of music, we go into the historical aspect. We look at it, that how it developed itself from the older music forms and how it influences the later music forms. So it is basically, when we are doing so, when we are analyzing rock and roll with this angle, we are actually talking about culture as a historical process. So cultural studies approaches and facilitates the identification of core issues or problems that no one discipline or approach can solve on its own. So therefore, the nature of cultural studies is interdisciplinary. It's because of this fact that cultural studies is very much interdisciplinary. Now, let us put a question in front of us right now at this juncture. How do people become a part of culture? This is a question, and we'll try to answer in the next few minutes. We'll try to answer this, that how do people become a part of a culture? Friends, what anthropology says, how people become a part of culture according to anthropology. Two processes. Anthropology talks about acculturation and inculturation. Acculturation, acculturation, and inculturation, enculturation. So this is what anthropology says. Psychology and the psychoanalysis says that people become a part of culture through the process of conditioning, whereas sociology says that it is basically the process of socializing. It is basically the process of socialization that people become a part of culture. So all these concepts pay attention on various social arrangements in how humans learn about meaning. The core issue of cultural studies is actually, my dear friends, the interpretation of meaning. This is the core issue of cultural studies. What is this? The interpretation of meaning. So how texts are interpreted into meanings. And when we say text, we do not mean a text of literature also, any text. The Taj Mahal is also a text. A musical piece is also a text. A film is also a text. So the core issue of cultural studies is the interpretation of meaning, and it involves issues of evidence and relativism. Now, dear friends, let us raise one more question, that how does cultural studies interpret what the things mean? Dear friends, anthropologists see culture as shared understandings and groupings in society. Sociologists like Luckman and Berger says that human knowledge of the world is socially constructed or through social location like gender, age, race, class, and through interaction with other people, we have increased, or we have generated, we have created human knowledge. So if so, we only see the world from certain angles. And when we see the world from certain angles, here comes the question of relativism. So, dear friends, there is nothing like true knowledge. The sociologists say that there is no true knowledge as such. Therefore, interpretation of meaning becomes important. Interpretation of meaning becomes the core of cultural studies. It relates to how we understand knowledge, how we interpret knowledge, how we interpret and understand our past and our present. So at this juncture, let us now talk about historical relativism. This is a very important aspect in cultural studies. Relativism or historical relativism is a very important aspect. Dear friends, in terms of past and present, there is a tradition, and this tradition is not objective. Rather, it is culturally constructed. What do I mean when I say that tradition is not objective? It is culturally constructed. I mean that some things are included and some things are excluded. For example, when we talk about the English canon, I mean the canons of English literature, when we talk about the canonical English prose, when we talk about canonical English poetry, for example, you know it very well that we exclude certain writers. We do not believe that they are canonical writers, they are standard writers. We include certain writers and believe in them that they are canonical writers. Friends, we might have a lot of writers writing at the time of Shakespeare. So there is this question of canon and non-canon is a very important aspect. And when we talk about canon and non-canon, what we are doing, we are actually going through the process of including certain things and excluding certain things. Similarly, when we talk about low culture and high culture, when we consider the certain culture is low and certain culture is high, so what we are going through, we are actually going through a phase of inclusion and exclusion. Dear friends, our traditional costumes, for example. So let us take a specific costume, a specific dress is acceptable for the high-ups of the society, and the same dress, the same costume is not acceptable to the people belonging to the lower order of the society. So even there is a kind of exclusion and inclusion with regard to our dress also, our costume also. So this is what we talk about, this is what we refer to, this is what we try to understand when we talk about historical relativism. Now let us talk about cultural relativism. And what is this cultural relativism is all about? Dear friends, interpretation of cultures from different parts of the world or different sections of our own society. For example, European, non-European culture, the culture of men and the culture of women, the culture of, what you can say, the different class of the society, the culture of different races of the society. Dear friends, scholars like Hollis and Lewis put both historical and cultural relativism under a title called perceptual relativism. The term historical and cultural relativism both has been termed by scholars like Hollis and Lewis as perceptual relativism. The degree to which perception is relative. When we look at something, do we actually see the same thing as another person looking at it? So this is all a matter of perception. Perceiving something with our perspective certainly will be different when someone else is perceiving the same object with his or her own perspective, for example. So studying culture, we must think about who we are, where we come from, and what our position is. In order to understand who and what we study, this is what we have to do. Let us now move on to a very important subject. Let us title it as about perceiving and valuing culture. So how we perceive our culture or culture as such, how we value culture. Due to cultural and historical relativism, there are notions of high culture and popular culture. I'm deliberately not using the term low culture. So there are popular notions of high culture, the elitist culture, and the popular or mass culture. And this distinction between high culture and the popular or mass culture is because of the cultural and historical relativism we have around us. This question of boundaries between levels of culture and the justification is an area of central concern in cultural studies. So thus, studies of the process of boundary maintenance and changes are issues of cultural change and continuity. These issues, my dear friends, and these concerns in cultural relativism introduces a very strong aspect in culture. And listen to this carefully. What is that strong aspect in culture? Power. That is power. Friends, before we move ahead and talk about power, let us now talk a bit about relationship between different cultures. Relationship between cultures. The conventional way of studying culture is to see cultures as mutually exclusive blocks that interact along a boundary or a zone of contact. Often describes the relationship in terms of destruction or corrupts through the, for example, through the process of colonialism, through the process of, for example, the recent one, globalization. We talk about the destruction of culture, we talk about the corruption of culture because of the effect of colonialism, because of the effect of globalization. So we will face not only one culture in one territory, but many. And so we will face not only one culture in one territory, but many. Since culture is also a matter of class, Culture is also a matter of age. Culture is also a matter of gender. Culture is also a matter of race, of ethnicity. Culture is also a matter of socio-political or socio-economic status. So that's why within one single territory, we may witness not one but many culture. And it does not operate simply in terms of stronger cultures destroying the weaker ones. Because culture, dear friends, is a never ending process of socially made meaning. It adapts, change, and mutate into new forms. It undergoes the process of hybridization. So that is why it is not a static thing. Let us now, friends, come to the concept of power. Let us now try to analyze a concept, a topic, culture and power. Since culture is a product of interaction and part of the social world, it is shaped by significant line of force that operates in the social world. All societies, my dear friends, are organized politically. All societies are also organized economically. And these arrangements, my dear friends, these arrangements of our society or societies produce certain social formation. The interests of dominant groups in society affect the culture. Listen to this line carefully. The interest, political, historical, cultural, economic. So the interest of the dominant group of the society affects or affect the culture of the society. One way is through the construction of tradition and its distribution through the population. Another view is that the dominant group uses mass culture to drug the subordinate groups. And here comes the propaganda theory of culture. And listen to this sentence, my dear friend, very carefully. How the propaganda theory of culture comes, that the dominant group of the society uses mass culture as a tool, as a kind of a weapon, as a kind of an instrument to drug the subordinate groups of that specific, that particular society. So whatever view is employed, culture is always linked with politics and power relations. And this relation is also a fruitful area of investigation in cultural studies. Dear friends, let us arise, let us come to this question, let us rise this question, that let us raise this question, that how is culture looked as power? Culture as power, culture as negotiated power, culture as resisted power. So how culture is negotiated, how culture is resisted, and it all happens because of power, socio-political power, socio-economic power. So due to different interests in society, there will be negotiations and resistance. So four areas of a struggle and negotiation that concern our cultural studies are, and these are minded, these are very major areas of negotiation of culture and power, and also resistance of culture and power. And what are those four areas? Gender, race, class, and age. For example, gender definitions and relations are never fixed, and it becomes the product of power struggle. So these struggle and resistance from the subordinated group often disturb the dominant ones, since it is a threat to their domination. So if there is some sort of a resistance from the subordinated group, it disturbs the dominant group since it is a threat to their domination. For example, the threat to the domination of patriarchy by the feminists. So, dear friends, culture shape who we are, and who we are, vice versa. Let us say like this, that who we are is shaped by culture. What do I mean? Struggle and negotiation are often around questions of cultural identity. Dear friends, I'm introducing one more term of cultural studies, that is called cultural identity. So, a struggle and negotiation are often around the questions of cultural identity. Friends, identity is very often connected to place, both locally as well as widely. Identity is quite often associated with place. So this serves as an important issue in the study of culture, in which identities are constructed and how they reflect particular distribution of power. Dear friends, let us now try to theorize culture. Let us now come to the theory aspect of culture, and in our next lectures, in the due course of the discussion of this series, cultural studies, we will be having a specific lectures on those theories that are associated with cultural studies. But let us now relate ourselves. Let us now talk about a few very dominant theories related to culture and cultural studies. The main leading theoretical approaches, and I would like to mention three dominant theoretical approaches here. One is called functionalism, the other is structuralism, and the next is, of course, post-structuralism. Dear friends, what this functionalism is, in a few lines, let us try to define what functionalism is. Functionalists, dear friends, functionalists argue that culture functions as a solution to the problems of social order because it contains values, it contains shared ideas about what is desirable in society. So this is what the functionalists believe. What they believe? They believe that culture functions as a solution to the problems of social order because it contains values, the shared ideas that are desirable for a society. So, dear friends, the core behind this concept of functionalism is that culture oils the wheels as it maintains the economy and it maintains the political system. So, since culture maintains the economy, culture maintains the political system. So, hence, culture oils the wheel of economy, culture oils the wheel of political system. In short, culture functions as the basic point for our economic and political concerns of our society. Structuralism, and what does the structuralist believe? That a phenomenon studied should be seen as consisting of a system of structures. This is what the structuralists believe, that a phenomenon studied should be seen as consisting of a system of a structure. The system and the relationship between different elements are more important than the individual element making up the system. There are four ideas regarding structuralism. The structure determines the position of each element of a whole. This is number one. The structure determines the position of each element of a whole. Number two is the belief that every system has a structure. Number three is the interest in the structural laws dealing with coexistence rather than changes. And number four is structures are the real things that lie beneath the surface or the appearance of meaning. And this is very important. The structures are the real things that lie beneath the surface or the appearance of meaning. And what post-structuralism says, what the post-structuralists believe, it emerges as a response on binary definitions developed from structuralism. Post-structuralism often works with the way in which versions of truth are produced in texts. Different versions of truth are produced in text through interpretation, which is always in dispute. Dear friends, look here. Interpretation is a very disputable thing, and this interpretation of a text creates different versions of truth. So unlike a structuralism, which tends to find the real structure or the real truth, post-structuralism tends to be more playful in practice. If not in outcome, post-structuralism is more playful in practice. Dear friends, we will be talking more about these theories later on in our later course of due course of time. We will be talking about it in this series. At this juncture, let us raise another point, and that is social structure and social conflicts. The concept of class, gender, and race, and how these things, class, gender, and race, is responsible both in creating the social structure and both in resulting social conflicts. Friends, there are theorists who believe that culture is a product of social conflict. The Marxists see social conflicts between classes. The feminists see gender relations as an unjust system. So this view that culture is a product of social conflict is a very prominent view. It is a very important view. In this view, society is structured by the dominant group. It is always the dominant group of the society, the group which is dominant in power, social power, political power, religious power, or whatsoever power it might be. The dominant group of the society structures the society, and hence it legitimizes inequality. Yes, the structure of a society is created by the dominant group of the society, and hence it creates and it legitimizes inequality. So thus cultural domination is an essential element of economic and political control. So it's all a matter of control. You will be dominating culturally if you are in control of economics and if you are in control of politics. If you are in control of these two powers, that is the economic power and the political power, you will be trying to dominate, or you will be dominating culturally. So this cultural domination is an essential element in economic and political control. Dear friends, culture need not be, however, seen as dependent upon social structure. It can also shape social structures. So, yes, true that culture is dependent on social structure, but this is not the only thing. It need not be seen only as dependent upon social culture. Culture can also shape its own social structure. Max Weber, for example, showed that the belief of early Protestant sects played a key role in the establishment of capitalism. Mind it, and I'm saying this with all responsibility. It is not that I am saying this. This is actually Max Weber who said this. That that the early Protestant sects played a key role in the establishment of capitalism. Dear friends, actually, what Max Weber's intention was to show how ideas can be effective forces in the historical development of societies. You must have heard about a very great philosopher, a very great name, Foucault. Foucault presents a more interwoven view of relationship between culture and society. In his notion of discourse, he argues that social groups, identities, and positions or any other cultural meanings are produced within discourses. So this is what Foucault says. In his notion of discourse, he argues that social groups, identities, and positions or any other cultural meanings are produced within discourses. So there is a flexible set of relationship between power, discourse, and what exists in the society, what exists in the world. Dear friends, cultural studies is an interdiscursive space. Let us now once again come to our understanding of our effort of understanding cultural studies. So it is an interdiscursive space which substance and methods are constituted from the collaboration of disciplines around the topic of culture. There are no fixed boundaries in the study, and its strength, the strength of cultural studies lies in its openness so that it may transform and it may grow. There are three main models of research in cultural studies. What are those three main models of research in cultural studies? Number one, production-based studies that involves the process and a struggle over the production of cultural items. Number two, text-based studies that investigates the forms of cultural products. And number three, studies of lived cultures that is concerned with how experience is presented. So dear friends, look here. Cultural studies is an area of activity that grows from interaction and collaboration to produce issues and themes that are new and challenging. Cultural studies is an area of activity that grows from interactions and collaborations to produce different issues and different themes that are very new and very challenging. Roland Barthes, you must have heard the name of this very great scholar. So Roland Barthes, on the nature of literary language, and Claude Lévi-Strauss on anthropology, on cultural studies, was influenced by structuralism and post-structuralism. Then we have Patrick Bradlinger. He pointed out that cultural studies is not a tightly coherent, unified movement with a fixed agenda, but a loosely coherent group of tendencies, issues, and questions. So, dear friends, cultural studies actually transcends the confines of a particular discipline, such as literature or philosophy or history or literary criticism. So it actually transcends all these confines of the particular disciplines. A scholar like Henry Giroux, Girous, so a scholar like Henry Giroux said that cultural studies practitioners are resisting intellectuals. It is very interesting. Look here. Giroux says that the practitioners of cultural studies are actually resisting intellectuals who see what they do as an emancipatory project because it erodes the traditional disciplinary divisions in most of the institutions of higher education. So cultural studies actually involves scrutinizing the cultural phenomena of a text and drawing conclusions about the changes in the textual phenomena over time. Cultural studies, dear friends, is politically engaged, and the cultural critics see themselves as oppositional not only within their own disciplines but to many of the power structures of the society at large. So, cultural studies, as such as a discipline, is basically a sort of a movement of opposition, a movement of resistance against power. And hence, the cultural critics see themselves as oppositional not only within their own disciplines but also to many of the power structures of the society. Meaning and individual subjectivity are culturally constructed. Meaning and individual subjectivity are culturally constructed, and hence they can also be deconstructed. They can also be reconstructed. They can also be demolished and reconstructed. They can also be changed and deconstructed. Because meaning and individual subjectivity can be constructed at any point of time. So something which can be constructed at any point of time is also open for deconstruction. Pierre Bourdieu, one of the theorists, explores how good taste, the so-called good taste, often reflects social, economic, and political power basis. So, something which you call good taste, that is a man of good taste, he is a man of not so good taste, low taste, something like that. So, this your very idea of somebody having good taste, some group, some human group, some human society, some human ethnic race having good taste and the other is having bad taste is basically a reflection of social, economic, and political power base. So, dear friends, cultural studies denies the separation of high and low. Remember, at the very outset, we said that cultural studies is not talking about is not about studying culture as elitist, culture as being spatial, culture as being the best in the civilization, but rather culture as ordinary. So, cultural studies denies the separation between high and low, between elite and popular, between the elite culture, the culture of the class, and the popular culture, the culture of the mass. So the cultural critic today, or rather the cultural critics today, work to transfer the term culture to include actually mass culture, whether popular culture is included also here, folk culture is also included here, urban culture is also included here. So the cultural critic or critics rather examine the practice of everyday life. So rather than determining which are the best works produced, the cultural critic describe what is produced and how various productions relate to one another. The cultural critic aims to reveal the political, economic reasons that why a certain cultural product is more valued, why a certain cultural product is not so valued at certain point of time. So finally, culture studies or cultural studies analyzes not only the cultural work but also the means of production. Yes, cultural studies, my dear friend, joins, it connects, it joins subjectivity with engagement. Subjectivity, that is culture in relation to the individual, and engagement, a direct approach to attacking the social ills. I think that at this juncture, I should mention several important types of cultural studies. Dear friends, when I am doing so, I am certainly mentioning a few important streams, a few important types of cultural studies. And when I'm doing so, I do not mean that those streams, those important, those types of cultural studies which I am excluding are not important. No, I don't mean that. But dear friends, British cultural materialism is one important type of cultural study. Historicism, or rather new historicism, is a very important type of cultural study. American multiculturalism is a very important type of cultural study. Postmodernism and popular culture is a very important field of a very important type of cultural studies. And post-colonial studies is also a very important field, is also a very important type of cultural studies. This British cultural materialism began in the 1950s. You know, we said earlier, we talked about it earlier, that that cultural studies as a discipline, cultural studies as a stream, was all experimented and began with the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies in the 1950s. So certainly this British cultural materialism began in the 1950s with the works of F.R. Lewis, which was heavily influenced by Arnold, and certainly Stuart Hall and Raymond Williams played a very important role in it. Then the second type, new historicism, is as a written to historical scholarship. New historicism concerns itself with extra literary matters. It talks about letters, it talks about diaries, it talks about films, it talks about paintings, the medical treatises also. So it looks at all these things to reveal the opposition historical tension in a text. A very important theorist in this regard is Frederick Jameson, who insisted, and I'm quoting in Frederick Jameson, who insisted, always historicize. This is his statement, always historicize. So right from a scholar like Hayden White, the practitioners of cultural studies learned how figurative relationships between present and past troops are shaped by historical discourses. These new historicists seek surprising coincidences that may cross a generic historical and cultural lines in borrowings of metaphor, ceremony, or popular culture. Foucault also belongs to this group. For Foucault, history was not the working out of the universal data. The new historicism rejects the periodization of history in favor of ordering history only through the interplay of forms of power. So this new historicism, my dear friends, rejects the periodization of history, and it favors the ordering of history only through the interplay of forms of power. Dear friends, another very important type of cultural studies is American multiculturalism. And this is very diverse, this is very wide. American multiculturalism actually consists of African American writers. It also consists of the Latino or Latino writers, the American Indian literature, and the Asian American writers. I mean, when I say Asian American, I'm excluding American Indian, which I have already mentioned earlier. So these four groups, when we talk about American multiculturalism as a very important as a very important field of cultural studies, four groups: African American writers, the Latino or Latino writers, American Indian writers, and Asian American writers. Dear friends, African American writers, when we talk about this, the African American writing often displays a folkloric conception of mankind, a double consciousness, as Du Bois called it, arising from bicultural identity, irony, parody, tragedy, bitter comedy in negotiating this ambivalence. It attacks upon presumed white cultural superiority. It is a naturalistic focus on survival and inventive reframing of language, which is a very modern aspect of this American or what I mean to say, the African American writings. When we talk about the African American writings, we remember the Harlem Renaissance, which signaled a tremendous upsurge in black culture with an special interest in primitivist art and the so-called new Negroes or the new Americans, the African Americans, what you can say. Langston Hughes is a prominent member of this Harlem Renaissance, a movement during the 1920s of black writers and intellectuals who were engaged in intense debate regarding the place of the African Americans in the American society, the place of African Americans in the American life, and on the role and the identity of the African American people, the role and the identity of the African American writer, the artist in the American society. The next, within this American multiculturalism, the next group is of Latino writers, those Spanish-speaking people of the United States. Majority of them from the Mexican residents stayed in the place, transformed into Mexican Americans with one single stroke of the pen. So one of the primary tropes in these Latino writers, in these Latino studies, has to do with the entire concept of borders. And look here, this is very interesting. Borders between nations, borders between cultures, and borders within cultures, my dear friends. So code switching from one language to another, this is called code switching. So the immediate code switching, when I'm talking with my brother, I'll be talking in a different language, and suddenly I started addressing my friend. He belongs to a very different culture, so I switch over to another language. So this code switching is a border phenomenon that is studied by linguists, and this is a very important aspect of these Latino writers. Speakers who code switch move back and forth between Spanish and English, for instance. They resort to, and even sometimes resort to, Spanglish. A very important aspect, my dear friend, of this Latino writing is liminality. Liminality. The betweenness. The betweenness is an important characteristic of the postmodern experience of this Latino writings. Another important aspect within this American multiculturalism is the experience of American Indian writers, the American Indian literature, which, my dear friends, has now become a very dominant area. In predominantly oral cultures, storytelling passes on as religious beliefs, as moral values, political codes, and practical lessons of everyday life. So for that American Indian, the great diaspora living in America, stories are a source of great strength. Stories from India are a source of great strength in the face of the centuries of silencing by the Euro Americans, by the Europeans and by the Americans. So that this American Indian writer, this American Indian literature is often preferred by Indians over the Native American. And my dear friends, when we talk about this, we talk about two type of Indian literature that is evolved as a field of study. The traditional Indian literature that includes tales, songs, and oratory, and the mainstream Indian literature that refers to the works written by the Indians in English in the traditional genres of fiction, poetry, and autobiography by Indians living in America. Uh, Another is within American cultural multiculturalism. Another and the last prominent group is Asian American writers. And here at this juncture, I would like to bring in a very famous and a very reputed, a very noted theorist, a philosopher, Edward Said, who has written of Orientalism, the tendency to objectify or exoticize Asians, and their work has sought to respond to such stereotyping. Asian American literature can be said to have begun around the turn of the 20th century, primarily with autobiographical papers and stories and confessions. The papers and stories were carefully fabricated for Chinese immigrant men to make the authorities believe that their New World sponsors were really their fathers. So they created this papers and stories. The Asian American autobiography inherited these descriptive strategies as a very famous scholar and a writer, Maxine Hong Kingston's text, The Women Warriors, Memoirs of Girlhood Among Ghosts, is a very important mention here. So identity may be individually known within, but not always at home in the outward community. The Chinese women writers can be mentioned here especially. Those Chinese women writers make up the largest and the most influential group of Asian American writers. For example, a writer like Jade Snow Wong and his very famous and her very famous text, Fifth Chinese Daughter. A writer like Amy Tan and the very famous text, Joy Luck Club, which traces the lives of four Chinese women immigrants starting in 1949 when they formed their Mahjong Club and swap stories of life in China. These mother vignettes alternate with their daughters' stories. Let us now move, dear friends, move on to another type of cultural studies, which we refer as postmodernism and the popular culture. My dear friends, postmodernism questions everything that rationalists' European philosophy held to be true. It questions everything. Postmodernism questions everything that the rationalist European philosophy held to be true. Beginning in the mid 1980s, postmodernism emerged in art, architecture, music, film, literature, sociology, communication studies, fashion, and other concerned fields. Postmodernism, my dear friends, borrows from modernist disillusionment with the givens of society, a penchant for irony, the self-conscious play within the work of art, fragmentation and ambiguity, and a destructured, decentered, dehumanized subject. Jean-Francois and Lyotard. Jean-Francois Lyotard is one philosopher. Jean-Francois Lyotard argues that stability is maintained through grand narratives. So, my dear friends, postmodernism argues that it is all contingent and that most cultural constructions have served the function of empowering members of a dominant social group at the expense of others. At this juncture, and towards the end part of my lecture, I would like to mention Jean Baudrillard, who describes the simulacra of postmodern life which have taken the place of real objects. So, these postmodernists, Baudrillard, Lyotard, these postmodernists assess how such factors as ethnicity, race, gender, class, age, region, sexuality, etc., are shaped by and even reshaped in popular culture. Uh, there are four main types of popular culture analysis, my dear friends. When we make an analysis of popular culture, there are four main types of popular culture analysis. One is the production analysis, the other is textual analysis, the next is audience analysis, and the next is historical analysis. Dear friends, all these analyses seek to get beneath the surface and talks about denotative meanings, and they examine more implicit the connotative social meanings. So production analysis asks the following kinds of question. What questions? Who owns the media? Who creates the text and why? Look here. Production analysis asks the question, who owns the media? Who creates the texts and why? Under what circumstances? Under what constraints? Textual analysis examines how a specific works of popular culture create meaning. Textual analysis analyzes, it examines how a specific works of popular culture, a text, a music, a film, an architectural piece, for example, how it creates meaning. Audience analysis asks how different groups of popular culture, consumers or users, make similar or different sense of the same text. This is what we do in audience analysis, that how different groups of popular culture consumers or users, the audience, make similar or different sense of the same text. And my dear friends, in historical analysis, we investigate how these other three dimensions change over time. Now, let us now move on to the last and a very prominent type of cultural studies, that is post-colonial studies. And again, I would like to mention Edward Said and his theory of Orientalism here. And what Said believed, what Said said. My dear friends, Edward Said's concept of Orientalism was an important touchstone in post-colonial studies. Post-colonialism, my dear friend, refers to a historical phase undergone by the third world countries after the decline of colonialism. Post-colonialism refers to a historical phase undergone by the third world countries after the decline of colonialism. It talks about the other as a construct, and this others constructs them based upon Western anxieties and preoccupations. Edward Said sharply critiques the Western images of the Oriental as irrational, depraved, fallen, childlike, different. So this is how the Western image is about the Oriental world. This is what the Westerners see towards the Oriental people: irrational, depraved, fallen, childlike, different. And why they do so? Because it has allowed the West to define itself as rational, virtuous, mature, and normal. So this looking down upon the Oriental people as being irrational, depraved, fallen, childlike, different, allows the Western people to define themselves and to present themselves as rational, virtuous, mature, and normal. My dear friends, many third world writers focus on both colonialism and the changes created in a post-colonial culture. For example, Frantz Fanon drew upon his own horrific experiences in French Algeria to deconstruct emerging national regimes. And a scholar like Homi K. Bhabha says that what drives white people to take over the world and spread their way of doing things is not power or even wanting to get rich, but their screwed up way of looking at the world. Look here, this is very important to note what Bhabha has to offer, what Bhabha has to say. And Bhabha, my dear friend, is a very important thinker. After Edward Said, he is a very important thinker in post-colonial studies. So he says that what drives white people to take over the world and spread their way of doing things is not power or not even wanting to get rich, rather their screwed up way of looking at the world. Bhabha's post-colonial theories involve analysis of nationality, ethnicity, and politics with the post-structuralist ideas of identity and indeterminacy, defining post-colonial identities as shifting and hybrid construction. At this juncture, I would like to mention a very important thinker of post-colonial theory, and that is Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak. Among post-colonial thinkers and among post-colonial feminists, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak examines the effects of political independence upon the subaltern or the sub-proletarian women in the third world countries. She reveals how female subjects are silenced by the dialogue between the male-dominated West and also the male-dominated East, offering little hope for the subaltern woman's voice to rise up amidst the global social institutions that oppresses her. My dear friends, let us stop here. Thank you very much.